Hello everyone, Xilonen, the Forger of Ancient Names, is the one new 5-star character releasing in Genshin patch 5.1. She is looking like a strong and versatile support in meta, being very competitive with, and in some aspects, surpassing the strengths of supports like Kazuha. Although Xilonen's finalized kit is very similar to her initial beta version and not much has changed throughout her beta, I wanted to sum up all of the updated information you need to know about Xilonen into one final guide. I will be explaining how Xilonen works, the best ways to build her, her potential best teams, and analyzing her place in the meta in terms of overall strength and pull value. Pretty much everything you need to know with simple and practical explanations while also giving more detailed analysis that is backed by TC. Xilonen is a 5-star Geo Sword character that ascends and scales with defense. As a character from Natlan, she plays around the Night Soul mechanic and has mobility built within her kit with her roller skates. Her primary and strongest role is as an off-field Geo support, having the ability to shred enemy resistances and heal the party. However, Xilonen does have the option to play as a main DPS, though this playstyle is significantly weaker than her role as a support. Although Xilonen is a Geo character, she is Geo in a similar way to how Navia is Geo, where they synergize with other elements like Pyro, Hydro, Electro, and Cryo rather than being designed around Mono Geo. In Xilonen's case, having characters of these elements in the team will be required in order to activate her role as a support. Xilonen's entire kit revolves around her elemental skill. After you press her skill, Xilonen deals damage, generates 4 Geo particles, and enters Night Soul's Blessing with 45 Night Soul points, which will gradually decrease. Night Soul's Blessing will end when you swap Xilonen off field, have no more points, or 9 seconds has passed, whichever happens first. During this enhanced state, Xilonen gains movement speed, the ability to climb walls faster, and her normal attacks get infused with Geo and gain defense scaling. This will be the primary way main DPS Xilonen will be dealing damage. However, the core part of Xilonen's skill is the source sample mechanic, which gives her supportive capabilities. When Xilonen enters Night Soul's Blessing with her skill, she gains 3 Geo samplers. These samplers can be changed into different elements depending on whether you have Pyro, Hydro, Electro, or Cryo units in the party. And when the samplers are active, nearby enemy elemental resistances are decreased for those specific elements. For example, in a Molani Burn Vape team with Emily, Xiangling, and Xilonen, 2 Geo samplers become Hydro and Pyro while the third stays Geo because Dendro doesn't interact. When all samplers are active, Xilonen gives Hydro, Pyro, and Geo Res Shred. Another example team is a Nivelette team with Farina, Xiangling, and Xilonen. Here, 2 of the Geos become Hydro while the third becomes Pyro. When all samplers are active, Xilonen gives Hydro and Pyro Res Shred. Samplers do not stack, so you don't get double Hydro Res Shred in this scenario. At talent level 10, Xilonen gives 36% Elemental Res Shred. This is very strong, as in comparison, Zhongli's shield gives 20% Res Shred, while 4-piece Viridis Inveterer gives 40% Res Shred. However, Xilonen cannot decrease enemy resistances unless her source samplers are active, and normally they are not active. The one exception is if Xilonen has a Geo sampler, the Geo Res Shred will be active only when Xilonen is on field and is in Night Soul's Blessing, which pretty much only benefits main DPS Xilonen. For a support Xilonen to activate her source samplers, she must get 90 Night Soul points. Remember that she starts with only 45. To gain Night Soul points, Xilonen has to meet the requirements of her A1 passive. If at least 2 of her source samplers change elements, Xilonen's attacks while in Night Soul's Blessing generate 35 Night Soul points. Otherwise, her attacks just deal extra damage. So if Xilonen has 2 characters in her team that are Pyro, Hydro, Electro, or Cryo, she can normal attack twice in Night Soul's Blessing to reach 90 Night Soul points. This instantly ends her enhanced state but activates all her source samplers, giving Res Shred of their corresponding elements to nearby enemies for 15 seconds. And this will work even while Xilonen is off field. Next, Xilonen's Elemental Burst. It just deals AoE damage but has an additional effect if you meet the same elemental requirements of her A1 passive. If Xilonen's team has 2 characters that are Pyro, Hydro, Electro, or Cryo, Xilonen's burst heals the active character every 1.5 seconds for 12 seconds, which is a total of 8 instances of healing. At 3000 defense, burst talent level 10, and a healing circuit, each healing tick is around 9000 HP, which is a lot of single target healing. If you don't meet the elemental requirement, Xilonen's burst doesn't heal, but it does 2 extra hits of damage. Lastly, Xilonen's remaining passives. Her A4 passive is quite interesting. Just like the other Natlan characters' A4s, Xilonen gets a buff when Night Soul Burst is triggered. In this case, she gets defense. However, Xilonen's A4 also allows her to trigger an effect which counts as an additional Night Soul Burst when she reaches full Night Soul points, which will happen normally if you play her correctly as a support. Remember that Night Soul Burst has a cooldown depending on the number of Natlan characters you have on the team. Xilonen's A4 passive allows for an additional stack that is separate from this normal cooldown, which allows characters like Molani to get additional stacks for their buffs, which is a nice small increase for their damage. These special passives are just exploration passives, allowing Xilonen to stay in Night Soul's Blessing in the overworld longer and not consume stamina while climbing walls during the enhanced state. She can also generate phlogiston when triggering Night Soul transmission. In summary, Xilonen needs at least 2 other characters in her party that are Pyro, Hydro, Electro, or Cryo in order for her to give the 15-second off-field res shred for the corresponding elements in the team and allow her to heal with her burst. For this supportive playstyle, her personal damage is irrelevant. Leveling her skill is the #1 priority to increase the res shred. Then you can level her burst just a bit until you have a comfortable amount of healing. In terms of her support gameplay rotation, it's short and simple. You can burst first if you need the healing, then skill to enter Night Soul's Blessing, normal attack twice to reach 90 Night Soul points and activate her res shred, then swap out. If you don't meet the team's elemental requirements, Xilonen's personal damage will increase at the cost of her supportive capabilities, which is ideal for a main DPS Xilonen. For this playstyle, you still want to prioritize leveling the skills since Xilonen still gets Geo res shred while she's on field. Then level her burst and normal talent somewhat equally as they both provide sources of damage. For a simple rotation guideline, just set up support skills, swap to Xilonen, burst if you have it, use her skill to enter Night Soul's Blessing, then normal attack until Night Soul's Blessing is over. Keep in mind that dashing to dodge will consume more Night Soul points, decreasing Xilonen's on-field damage window. Let's cover Xilonen's Constellations. Her C1 extends her Night Soul's Blessing duration from a maximum of 9 seconds to 12 seconds. This is only relevant for main DPS Xilonen and for overworld exploration. In addition, when her res shred is active, the party gets interruption resistance, the same amount as Hu Tao's skill. Next, her C2. This constellation looks very strong, but in reality, it's a decent team damage boost, but nothing too outstanding. First, if Xilonen has a Geo sampler, it will always be active with C2. This means that in a team like Mono Geo Ito, a C2 Xilonen is able to provide off-field Geo res shred for the team. A C0 Xilonen in the same team wouldn't provide off-field Geo res shred. Do keep in mind that even with C2, Xilonen's burst won't heal in these teams. In addition, C2 also gives an additional buff to the characters that match the element of the active source samplers. For example, in a Molani Burn Vape team, you would activate Hydro, Pyro, and Geo res shred. With C2, Molani gets 45% HP, Xiangling gets 45% attack, and Xilonen gets 50% damage bonus. In contrast, a standard Neuvillette team will only have Geo and Hydro res shred active. With C2, Neuvillette and Farina both gain 45% HP, and Xilonen gets 50% damage bonus. Since the additional buffs aren't shared party-wide and are specific to the characters on the team, how strong C2 is varies from team to team. Generally, it is about a 15% team damage boost, so it is a good constellation, but nothing too crazy, as some very strong constellations in the game can buff damage by 20 or more percent. C3 increases Xilonen's skill talent level by 3, C4 gives a team 6 coordinated attacks after Xilonen uses her skill, which can be activated by anyone in the party when they use normal, charged, or plunging attacks. The scaling is pretty low though, so it's not very strong. C5 increases Xilonen's burst talent level by 3, and lastly C6 gives Xilonen an additional enhanced Night Soul's Blessing, which gives her massive on-field damage and the ability to heal the party every hit for 5 seconds. A classic on-field DPS C6 for a support, which acts similarly to Farina C6. Overall, C0 Xilonen is already very strong. If you're looking for some vertical investment, C2 is really the only enticing constellation, with potentially C1 being nice for the extra interruption resistance. However, because C1 only gives comfort and not raw damage, and you need to pull C2 until you actually get a team damage boost, unless you really want Xilonen to support a Mono Geo team with her C2, I would recommend getting her signature weapon over her constellations if you want to vertically invest, as it requires fewer pulls. Speaking of her signature weapon, let's go over the best weapons to use on Xilonen. As a support, she pretty much has 3 main options. Her signature weapon gives a lot of defense. As for its passive, as long as you normal attack an enemy twice, which will happen with Xilonen to activate her res shred, Xilonen gains additional defense, damage bonus for herself, and gives the entire team elemental damage bonus. This team buff is the main reason this weapon is quite strong. In order to get the max team buff of 25.6% damage bonus, you will need to build 3200 defense, which is fairly easy. Compared to C2, this signature weapon is slightly weaker in terms of increasing the team's damage, but it's not a large difference, so in my opinion, getting R1 over C2 is the way to go, since it's way cheaper unless you really want Xilonen to support in Mono Geo. Her signature is strong, but by no means necessary. Freedom Sworn is another great 5-star option for her. You'll need to crystallize twice to get its buff, so you either need to rely on her elemental burst and then skill into N2, or you can skill, wait a bit, then perform her N2 to activate the Freedom Sworn passive, which will extend rotation time. If you're fine with this, and if your team can take full advantage of Freedom Sworn's buffs, this weapon can be as good as her signature. Lastly, the one and pretty much only 4-star weapon you should use is Favonius Sword. Favonius is a great support weapon because of the extra particles, and the extra energy can arguably be better for a team than the 5-star weapon buffs. If you don't have any of these weapons weapons, then you'll have to use the natlan craftable. It does give a lot of defense, which increases Xilonen's healing, but that's pretty much it, as the damage boost is irrelevant for a support Xilonen. For main DPS Xilonen, her signature is still good, though its focus will still be buffing the team. Otherwise, any crit based weapon is good. Mistsplitter, Uraku Misugiri, Black Sword, and Harbinger of Dawn are good options. For artifact stats, as a natlan support, 4-piece scroll will be her main set. With this set, not only will Xilonen shred elemental resistances, but she will also give damage bonus of the crystallized elements for the team. This will generally be her one and only support set. However, if the team already has a holder of 4-piece scroll, such as if Malvika becomes a better user of the set, then Xilonen can use 4-piece Archaic Petra or 4-piece Instructor to provide another source of buffs for the team. For artifact stats as a support, defense or energy recharge hourglass, defense goblet, then healing bonus circlet or crit rate circlet if you're using Favonius sword. Substats focus on crit rate if you're using Favonius, then ER in defense. Xilonen can have a low ER requirement of 140%, but if you run either Favonius sword or run an ER glass, or you just have a lot of ER substats, then you'll have plenty of energy recharge. Ultimately, the only stat requirement Xilonen has is 3200 defense if you are using her signature weapon, which itself is easily met with the signature and the main stats. Otherwise, you don't have to worry too much about getting specific stats other than maybe crit rate for Favonius sword, making Xilonen a cheap support to build. You can just get a 4-piece scroll with the correct main stats, not even worry about substats, and she'll be good to go. For main DPS Xilonen, her main artifact set is 4-piece Obsidian Codex. 4-piece Husk and 4-piece Nighttime Whispers are okay alternatives. For stats, go Defense Hourglass, Geo Goblet, Crit Circlet. Just the typical DPS setup for any defense scaler. Finally, let's go over Xilonen's best team options. The one thing you need to remember about team building is that in order for Xilonen to support a team, the team must have at least 2 other characters in the party that are Pyro, Hydro, Electro, or Cryo in order to activate Xilonen's elemental res shred through her A1 and allow her to heal with her burst. If you don't meet this requirement, Xilonen can't buff the team. So in teams like Navi, Plunge, or Mono Geo, Xilonen doesn't do anything in these teams unless she's C2. In addition, Xilonen doesn't provide Dendro or Anemo res shred, so you can't play Xilonen with Dendro or Anemo main DPSs like Kanich or Xiao. The only team where you don't want to meet this elemental requirement is if you're playing main DPS Xilonen, where she's pretty much locked to Mono Geo. These teams deal okay damage, but nothing too amazing. On paper, Xilonen main DPS does similar damage to Ito in the same exact team. However, one flaw main DPS Xilonen has is that you can't dodge on her, or else you consume extra Night Soul points, which shortens her duration in Night Soul's Blessing. But aside from these types of teams, Xilonen will primarily serve as a support, and theoretically, you can run any team with her as long as the team fulfills the 2 Pyro, Hydro, Electro, or Cryo character requirement, and the team will function fine. Thus, Xilonen can fit into many different team archetypes as a buffer, and she will perform similarly compared to existing supports in those teams. Here are some of the main team archetypes you can consider. You can run Xilonen in a Mono Pyro team supporting characters like Linny and Arlecchino instead of using Kazuha and get similar results. Xilonen also works well with double Hydro Hu Tao, providing a similar amount of damage buffs to Xian Yun in her slot. Even freeze teams like with Ayaka can utilize Xilonen for her buffs since she has low Geo application which won't shatter freeze uptime. You can also utilize Xilonen in standard aggravate teams as the buffer instead of Kazuha. However, while Xilonen does work in these teams, Kazuha will generally be better because he provides a lot of damage from aggravating his electro swirls, and aggravate teams typically have an easier time maintaining his buff uptime. And even though C0 Xilonen doesn't work as a support for Mono Geo, she can still buff characters like Ito and Noelle. You just can't use any other Geo units, so you'll have to use characters of other elements like Farina, Yelan, and Bennett. Consequently, you can't use Goro, who is a big buffer for specifically Ito, which is a cost you have to consider when using Xilonen. In most teams, Xilonen is a good side grade to existing support characters. However, where Xilonen is able to really shine as a strong support is when she provides more damage than the existing alternatives, or the team really appreciates her longer buff uptime. Here are 3 main teams that Xilonen significantly upgrades. First, standard Navia teams. Xilonen provides more damage through her res shred and damage bonus compared to Zhongli or Kachina. Although Xilonen's absence of an off-field presence decreases crystallized shards for Navia, her buffs are still enough to improve the team. Second, Milani Vape teams. Although Kazuha is a great buffer for Milani, it can be difficult to perform the correct swirl setups and ensure that all of Milani's hits fit into his buff duration. Xilonen's longer buff duration fixes these rotational issues. In addition, Xilonen serves as a healer for the team, which gives you the ability to slot in Farina easier. On top of that, Xilonen provides extra Night Soul burst triggers for Milani, further buffing Milani's elemental burst. And lastly, Nebulette teams can greatly take advantage of Xilonen. Yes, the arguably best DPS in the game got a buff. The typical Neuvillette team includes Furina, Kazuha, and either Baizhu or Zhongli. Baizhu is a great option for his healing, and Zhongli provides an additional buff with his Red Shred. Xilonen takes the best part of both units, combining Baizhu's healing and Zhongli's Red Shred while adding even more damage with 4-piece scroll at the cost of losing resistance to interruption. By allowing Xilonen to pair with Kazuha to buff both Furina and Neuvillette, we create the new general best Neuvillette team. To conclude this Xilonen guide, I wanted to share my analysis on her place in the meta in terms of overall strength and pull value. In her primary role as a support, even though Xilonen doesn't do any personal damage herself, her buffs are both strong and versatile, making her solid in a lot of existing teams. When analyzing what Xilonen specifically provides to a team, you will notice that her buffs are very similar to Kazuha's buffs. In a way, Xilonen can be considered a Geo version of Kazuha. If we compare the two directly, they both provide similar amounts of res shred and damage bonus to a team, so they do increase a team's damage by a similar amount. The biggest difference with their buffs, however, is their durations. Xilonen's buffs last significantly longer than Kazuha's. In addition, Kazuha requires you to swirl specific elements on enemies for his damage bonus buff and his res shred. Xilonen also has to trigger the correct crystallize for 4-piece scroll, but her res shred doesn't have this requirement, making her much more consistent in multi-wave content. And lastly, Xilonen provides healing, while Kazuha provides grouping and does a good amount of personal AoE damage from swirls. In many cases, Xilonen is a Kazuha alternative similar to Yelan and Xingqiu. Where Xilonen can outperform Kazuha is when you need her healing or her longer uptime of buffs. For some teams, it is hard to deal proper swirl setups with Kazuha that can fully buff a DPS's uptime. In these teams, Xilonen's longer buff duration is extremely helpful to improve rotations and buff uptime, resulting in an overall increase in team DPS over using Kazuha. Lastly, instead of using one character or the other, you can pair Xilonen and Kazuha together in some teams, resulting in a powerful support duo for a main DPS. Thus, Xilonen isn't broken and doesn't power creep Kazuha, but is a solid alternative to him who has her own unique strengths. Now, as I mentioned in the team section, in most teams where you can slot Xilonen as a support, she is usually a side grade to existing alternatives. She can be slightly better or worse depending on the team and specific combat situations. There really only are a few teams where Xilonen clearly upgrades a team on paper, such as Navia, Molani, and Neuvillette. Thus, you can argue that Xilonen is actually somewhat underwhelming, and I'm sure that there will be takes like this. And although this is somewhat true when considering all the TC that has been currently done on Xilonen's teams, I think that a lot of Xilonen's strengths won't be reflected in the sheets. Xilonen's longer buff duration and her res shred just being tied to her skill being active makes Xilonen a very potent buffer in multi-wave content, which is a huge benefit when you're clearing waves of enemies. Her longer buff duration will also make it easier for the average player to properly buff their carries. On top of that, Xilonen being a healer will allow people to play comfier teams, as well as providing great synergy with Furina. Ultimately, even if you consider Xilonen to be just a side grade to existing supports like Kazuha, who definitely isn't as meta dominant as he was before, I do still consider Kazuha to be a top tier support, which makes Xilonen top tier as well. Thus, I do think that Xilonen is a top meta support and is one of the best 5-star support characters you can pull in this game. Still not a must pull, as she does have some flaws and limitations, but her ability to provide strong buffs to a good portion of the existing character roster of Genshin makes Xilonen a very valuable pull to your account if you choose to pull her. And she may fill an even more important support role for any future characters releasing in natlan. And that's everything I wanted to cover about Xilonen. I hope this guide and analysis was helpful to y'all in giving you a better understanding of everything related to Xilonen. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. Like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed the video and want to see more guides like this on future characters. Also, I have a small Discord server, so if you just want to discuss about Genshin, ask any questions, or just chill, feel free to join. For all of you planning on wishing, I wish you the best of luck on your Xilonen pulls.